the current perspectives about managing dry eyes and the applications from the dry eye workshop too. Besides that, we have panelists and chairpersons. We have Dr. Vinay Agarwal, very senior cornea specialist. Welcome, sir. We have Dr. Kavita Rao, again, very accomplished in her own way. We have Dr. Mamta. So, three of them will be carrying on the panel discussion, and as usual, we'll be taking questions from the chat and also dissecting and discussing those questions. So, without further delay, I would ask Dr. Hijab to start sharing a screen and start the presentation. Swapnesh, you want to add something before she starts?
Yeah, only thing is we have renewed our subscription, and I hope it's an uninterrupted session. But just in case there is some technical glitch, then I would request everybody to log out, wait for a minute, and then log in again with the same password and ID. We can start, sir.
Okay. I also welcome Dr. Hanuman Bhosle, sir, who's joined us today. He was not able to join with his name, so I think he's joined, but he had some problems joining the Zoom. So welcome, Dr. Hanuman, sir. So let's start.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, BOA. Thank you, Dr. Swapnesh and Dr. Pritam. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Thank you. So today the talk is going to be on dry eye and glaucoma. I decided to talk about dry eye and glaucoma is because all of us are seeing more glaucoma patients than somebody who's coming to us with a primary Sjogren's or a secondary Sjogren's syndrome. So we all know that glaucoma is a progressive optic neuropathy with characteristic changes in the optic nerve head and the visual fields. There are around 60 million individuals worldwide who have glaucoma, and the number is expected to increase to 80 million this year. There are several risk factors associated with glaucoma onset and progression. High intraocular pressure is the most important risk factor and the only one that can be modified. Lowering the IOP is the most efficient and clinically accepted form of therapy to avoid deterioration in the optic nerves and the visual fields. Despite advances in laser and surgical treatments, topical hypotensive drops remain the mainstay of treatment. The chronic nature of disease requires long-term treatment and often with multiple ophthalmic medications. Ocular surface disease is a broad term. It's an umbrella term to include dry eye, which includes both the evaporative and aqueous deficiency dry eye, resulting in a number of pathologic features on the ocular surface. The definition of dry eye, I think, will be covered by Dr. Kunjal in her next talk. The frequency of ocular surface disease and glaucoma increases with advancing age, which makes them both common comorbidities in the same patient. There is an increase in the ocular surface disease with an increase of glaucoma severity because patients with more advanced glaucoma tend to be on multiple drops and they are on a longer duration of treatment. The prevalence of OSD in glaucoma is 11% if the patient is on one drug, and it increases to 40% if they are on two or more drugs. 40% of the glaucoma patients worldwide require more than one IOP lowering agent daily. 1 in 6 patients with glaucoma will have OSD severe enough to warrant some kind of treatment. Using the ocular surface disease index, it has been shown that up to 60% of glaucoma patients have OSD, both of which can independently impact their quality of life and affect compliance with the medication. The etiology of OSD in glaucoma is multifactorial. The multiple daily exposures of the ocular surface to the active drug and preservatives in the medicine, and also the propensity of the individual patient to develop allergy or toxic reaction to them, affects the ocular surface. The commonly used preservatives and eye drops are BAK, benzalkonium chloride. It's a quaternary ammonium compound. It is an effective antimicrobial. It damages the cell wall and the cytoplasmic membranes due to its detergent action. This is how it works as an antimicrobial. It prevents contamination in multi-dose containers. It also acts as a surfactant by which it promotes the drug penetration into the anterior chamber. So it improves the efficacy of the anti-glaucoma drop. And once instilled in the eye, it remains in the eye for 7 days, gets incorporated in the cell membranes. It's got a half-life of up to 12 hours. The concentration that is used in eye drops is 0.015% to 0.02%, but even as low as 0.005% is toxic. How does BAK affect? It damages the corneal and the conjunctival epithelial cellular architecture by damaging the cell DNA. It disrupts the epithelial tight junctions, induces cell apoptosis, necrosis, decreases the viability of the cells, induces an inflammatory response, impairs cellular proliferation, causes subconjunctival fibrosis, loss of goblet cells. It decreases the density of the subbasal corneal nerves, reduces corneal sensitivity, and all of this results in, a dry eye kind of picture. Experimental studies have shown that a 15-minute exposure to a very low concentration of BAC can damage trabecular cells in culture and induce their apoptosis. BAC also accumulates in the trabecular cells, inducing chronic inflammation and glaucoma-like changes. So maybe the apparent loss of IOP-lowering drugs that we see over a period of time could be due to BAC toxicity and inflammation of the trabecular meshwork cells. So why is BAC still used? Because it is freely available. The alternative preservatives that are there don't meet the requirements of all countries. Newer preservatives will require approval processes, more effort, more money. And the side effects of BAC are not seen in all patients, especially if the drop is used for a short time. And patients who are on chronic treatment with BAK containing medications, it will require 8 to 12 weeks of stopping the drop for the ocular surface to improve. The newer preservatives are Sofzia. It's an oxidizing agent. It is a balanced ionic buffer solution which contains borate, propylene glycol, sorbitol, and zinc chloride. It converts to non-toxic byproducts after coming in contact with the ocular surface. However, corneal calcification can occur with topical glaucoma medications preserved with this buffer-based system, which have high phosphate concentration. Then the other preservative is Purite. It is a stabilized oxidative type oxychlorocomplex with antimicrobial efficacy. It is less disruptive to cellular integrity compared to the other preservatives. The catalases which are present in the mammalian cells metabolize it. The claim is that it dissipates into water and sodium chloride, which are natural components of the tears when exposed to ambient light. However, the chloride ions which are produced cause a high degree of oxidation of intracellular glutathione, and this glutathione protects the cells from oxidative stress. So if used over a long period of time, they are also going to damage the corneal and the conjunctival epithelium. Then polyquat is another quaternary ammonium compound. It is less toxic to the ocular surface. Sodium perborate or Gen Aqua is another newer preservative. It turns into pure water and oxygen upon contact with the eye. However, the perborate is transformed into borate ions and hydrogen peroxide first. Before that, disintegrates to form water and oxygen. So peroxide can also damage the ocular surface. So we all know what BAK does to the conjunctival corneal epithelium and subsequently the tear film. These newer preservatives, Sofzia, Polyquat, Purite, also damage the tear film if used for a long period. They do damage the corneal epithelium, the surface microvilli. They cause goblet cell death. They increase the fibroblasts in the conjunctival stroma, increase the inflammatory cytokines and the inflammatory cells in the conjunctival stroma. So not only the preservatives, but also the active drug can cause damage to the ocular surface. Timolol, for example, causes burning, can cause burning, redness, decreases ocular blood flow, decreases the corneal sensation. Brimonidine is notorious for causing allergy after some time of use. Patients come back with itching, redness, follicular conjunctivitis. Then we have the carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, dorzolamide and brinzolamide, which can also cause stinging, irritation, redness of eyes upon instillation. And you need to use them with caution in patients who have got poor endothelial function. The prostaglandin analogs we know cause conjunctival hyperemia. They increase the periocular skin pigmentation, can cause a change in the iris color and eyelash growth. The symptoms of ocular surface disease, whatever the etiology, will remain the same. There is burning, foreign body sensation, itching, photophobia. The Schirmer's test will show a low value. There will be a reduced tear film breakup time. There will be corneal, conjunctival, epithelial staining. There will be bulbar, limbal hyperemia. This is a patient on brimonidine showing follicular conjunctivitis, the diffuse punctate staining of the corneal epithelium due to toxicity. Then this patient had come with corneal filaments. He already had trap done to save the bleb. He had 5-FU injection post trap. He was still putting glaucoma medications. Then this is the typical lid skin hyperpigmentation contact dermatitis that is seen in patients on prostaglandin analogs. Then also I have noted this corneal haze, corneal edema in patients with good pseudophakia. They are post trabeculectomy, still on multiple drops. Over a period of time, they tend to develop this little corneal edema. And also post graft patients who are on glaucoma treatment, they are at a high risk of graft failure. So whether it is the active drug, whether it is the preservative, whether the persistently elevated IOP or the trauma of surgery or a combination of all the factors which is damaging the endothelium, we don't know. So ocular surface disease occurs due to toxicity of the preservatives and the active drug. It could also be an allergic reaction to the preservative or the active drug. To differentiate what it is, we need to just stop the existing medication and switch to a preservative-free formulation of another medication. Long-term therapy of anti-glaucoma medicines also produces inflammatory changes, increases the fibroblasts in the conjunctiva, which shows the success rate of any glaucoma filtration surgery. There is a school of thought which feels that you stop the glaucoma drops at least 1 to 2 weeks prior to surgery, give a low-potency topical steroid, bring down the surface inflammation, can give oral acetozolamide in the meanwhile to keep the IOP in control, and then you go ahead and perform the glaucoma surgery to improve the chances of success. Long-term glaucoma medications also cause conjunctival foreshortening, shrinkage, which mimics an ocular pemphigoid-like picture. You can see in this that the patient has got conjunctival congestion, there is corneal scarring and all. And if you're doing cataract surgery in these patients, when you open the lid speculum, you realize the resistance that you face to open it completely. The diagnosis of OSD in glaucoma patients is often overlooked since the focus is more on IOP control and on the markers of glaucoma progression. But however, a good history and examination will help us detect these patients. Then different studies have also shown that the prevalence of ocular surface disease in glaucoma patients is as much as 60%. And the severity will depend upon the number of IOP lowering medications that are used, the presence of preservatives like BAC, and the duration of the treatment and the age. The older the age, the greater the chance of OSD. Then it has also been shown that patients, when shifted to BAC-free formulations, the ocular surface improved significantly. So the therapeutic options for OSD and glaucoma, you need to individualize the treatment for each patient. We need to reduce the drop-induced toxicity and also treat the dry eye simultaneously. Preservative-free anti-glaucoma drops are preferred whenever possible. However, if cost is an issue, then maybe one could consider this decision-making algorithm. If patients are symptomatic, they have symptoms of dry eye, then preservative-free formulation is better. If they do not have symptoms, but on fluorescein stain, they show the presence of filaments or punctate staining, then again a preservative-free formulation is preferred. If no staining, but if the tear film breakup time is less than 5 seconds, then again a preservative-free formulation is preferred. Otherwise, one could consider a preserved formulation. Instead of giving 3 different drugs, it is always better to give fixed drug combinations. This will improve the patient's compliance with the medication. It will reduce the preservatives going on the ocular surface. It will also reduce the washout effect which is present when multiple drops are instilled. Laser surgery or something like laser trabeculoplasty or trabeculectomy could be considered in patients who are not tolerating topical medicines. Preservative-free artificial tears along with lubricating gels could be given at bedtime. Short-term use of mild steroids can be considered to bring down the surface inflammation, and be watchful for the IOP elevation. For chronic surface inflammation, a steroid-sparing agent like topical cyclosporin can be given. Then this is going to be spoken at length by Dr. Kunjal, but just to make a passing mention that we also need to analyze other risk factors. If the patient has got a systemic condition that is worsening his dry eye status, then that will need to be addressed. And this also will be covered by Kunjal. If the medications alone are not working, we may also need to consider something like a punctal occlusion. We may need to treat the meibomian gland disease if present. So to conclude, topical treatment for glaucoma will continue to be the mainstay of every glaucoma patient with chronic topical medications. Ocular surface disease symptoms should be evaluated and should be treated in time. The severity of OSD is related to the number of medications, the number of times each medicine is instilled, the duration of treatment, the active compound, the presence, and the type of preservative. Switching glaucoma therapy from a preserved to a preservative-free preparation is always better, and the preservative-free glaucoma therapy has the same IOP-lowering efficacy as a preserved formulation. New dispensers that incorporate unidirectional valves allow multi-dose bottles to be unpreserved. This will be an economical option, something like a Komoot technology, the continuous monodose technology, and now Novelia technology, which a lot of Indian companies have come up with. Thank you.
I think that was a very quite a precise and concise presentation on what problems we can face with glaucoma eye drops. I think we will go on to the second presentation like we decided, and then follow that up with, there are already a lot of queries and suggestions which are coming up on the chat. So myself and Swapnesh, we are noting them, and we'll take all the questions at the end. So Dr. Kunjal.
Very good evening, everybody. At the outset, I'd like to thank Dr. Preetham and Dr. Swapnesh for the opportunity. Am I audible well?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Start sharing my screen. Is the presentation visible?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll be talking on the clinical applications of DEWS 2. So the Dry Eye Workshop Review Report is an effort of the Tearfilm and the Ocular Surface Society. The first report came out in 2007, and then another revised report was published in 2017. This report brought together 150 clinical and basic science research experts from around the world, and with the help of 12 subcommittees who looked into the definition, classification, prevalence, the pathophysiology, the management, signs and symptoms, and the further research which is possible into the dry eye. They have published several reports of the same. However, we'll be concentrating today only on the clinical aspects relevant from this review report. So the first report classified dry eye. One second, I'll just need to minimize the screen. One second. Sorry. Okay. So the first report defined dry eye as a multifactorial disease of the tears and the ocular surface that results in symptoms of discomfort, visual disturbance, and tear film instability with potential damage to the ocular surface. It is accompanied by increased osmolarity of the tear film and inflammation. However, the DEWS 2 revised this classification definition. It agreed that dry eye is indeed a multifactorial disease of the ocular surface characterized by a loss of homeostasis of the tear film, and it can be accompanied by ocular symptoms. There may be patients who may not have symptoms and signs, and they said that the tear film instability, hypoosmolarity, inflammation, and neurosensory abnormalities were not just accompaniments but were etiological factors in the dry eye manifestations. Now, coming to the classification of dry eye, we all know that dry eye is primarily classified as aqueous, deficient, and evaporative. In the first dry eye report, these were considered as separate entities. However, in the DEWS 2, it was realized that there may be a mixed variety also which exists. Now, when a patient comes to you with the symptoms and signs of dry eye, then it is very easy to classify them and manage accordingly. However, if you have a patient who has symptoms of dry eye, but on examination does not have any signs, like say a patient with computer vision syndrome, or he may be a patient who is prone to dry eye, so needs education of his condition and some preventive therapy and regular follow-up. Also to be noted, this category includes the patients who have neuropathic pain and especially patients who have like a post-LASIK neuropathic pain. They should be appropriately referred for pain management. Then we may have some patients who may be asymptomatic and are being picked up to have signs of dry eye during your routine clinical evaluation, say like a post-LASIK or a pre-LASIK or a pre-cataract workup evaluation. These are the ones who need to be given treatment prior to taking them up for surgery. Also to be noted, there are some patients because of chronic dry eye may have nerve damage and they have dysfunction sensations. That's why they don't realize that they have symptoms, but they do have signs and they need to be treated appropriately. Now, the pathophysiology in very brief, we know that aqueous deficient dry eye will have a low volume of the tear film. It's basically caused by any autoimmune disorder which will not allow production of the tears like primary and the secondary Sjogren's syndrome. However, surgically also this can be induced. It can happen in patients with chronic contact lens wear also. Basically, the evaporative dry eye is a result of Meibomian gland disease and any abnormalities of the lids or chronic use of or eye drops with preservatives, ocular allergies or contact lens wear also can cause evaporative dry eye. Basically, what happens is that a low flow and a high evaporation increases the tear hypoosmolarity. Now, this incites the inflammatory cascade. This makes the tear film unstable and this further increases the hypoosmolarity and the vicious cycle of dry eye starts. Now, the DUCE-2 proposed a diagnostic algorithm to be followed in the management of the patients. First, to decide whether the patient has a dry eye or something else like an allergy, you need to ask basic questions of the symptoms of dry eye. You can also take history of relevant systemic findings like acne, rosacea, or dryness of the mouth or rheumatoid arthritis. After this, you do a risk factor analysis. Check if the patient is menopausal in age. Has the patient had any surgery? Is the patient on any long-term glaucoma medications? Or is the patient a contact lens wearer? After you have done that, you come to the screening criteria. If you want to quantify the symptoms, then you should use the questionnaires which are available. There are many available, but the dry eye questionnaire DEQ-5 and the OSDI, Ocular Surface Disease Index, are commonly used. An Ocular Surface Disease Index score of more than 13 is considered to be abnormal. Then you come to the homeostasis markers. Basically, these evaluate the tear film. We'll be looking at each of them in the subsequent slides. After you do this, you do tests which will help you to differentiate between evaporated and aqueous deficient dry eye. And then you segregate them into the various severity classifications and then manage accordingly. Coming to the diagnostic test. So the first test is the tear film breakup time. We all do this practically in our clinics every time. Basically, you just instill a drop of fluorescein and then after 2-3 stable blinks, you ask the patient not to blink and you look out for the first spot, the dark spot where the tear film breaks. Any breakup time of less than 10 seconds is considered to be abnormal. However, with the advent of various Placido-based devices and the ocular surface analyzer and the LipiView, which gives us a non-invasive tear film breakup time, it is coming into vogue and it is being considered as the preferred method for checking the tear film breakup time. The next test is the osmolarity. This is not widely available. However, the tear lab osmolarity instrument can be used, and if the values are over 308 milliosmoles, it's considered to be abnormal. What is more important is the intraocular differences of more than 8 milliosmoles is also indicative of dry eye. Any value of more than 340 is indicative of severe dry eye. Corneal surface staining is the most important clinical assessment according to me. And not only the corneal staining, but also the conjunctival staining should be seen. Fluorescein or Lissamin green stain should be used. And then you should use either some grading pattern and follow it, or you make a diagram which you would like to follow and see whether the pattern is very focal or like a branching phone-like pattern or very confluent pattern of the SPKs. Next, we come to the test which will help us differentiate between the aqueous deficient and the evaporative dry eye. In this, the most important is the Schirmer's test, which we all know. Any value of less than 10 is considered to be abnormal. The tear meniscus height measurement can be done on the slit lamp. However, that's not very reliable and it is very subjective. And hence you can use various devices to quantify the tear volume. The next is the ocular surface inflammation. There are many devices which will give you the ocular or bulbar redness scoring pattern, which you can note, or on clinical examination, especially in patients who have, say, like a secondary Sjogren's syndrome or who are having chronic MGD. It's not unusual to find a very inflamed ocular surface. Also, in patients who don't have this very obvious redness and you want to check for ocular surface inflammation, you can use this Inflamma Dry Eye Kit, which basically will check for MMP9 levels. Any value of any level of more than 40 nanograms per ml will give you a positive test. Next, coming to the test for evaporative dry eye. In this, basically, you're going to assess the lid margin and the meibomian gland. You should look for any telangiectasia at the lid margins. You should look at the if there are, the blocked orifices or any like pouting of the meibomian glands here. You should press on the meibomian glands and see what is the quality of the meibum expressed, whether it is clear or it's a toothpaste-like secretion, and also whether all the glands are able to express the secretions or you are seeing any blocked glands. Also pay attention to the blink rate of the patient. Anything more than anything which is very frequent blinking, like more than 15, may be abnormal, and also see whether the blink is complete or incomplete and whether there is any lag of ophthalmos. Next, we come to meibography. Any infrared device like the AutoRef or all the topography-based systems which are available now can help you image the meibomian glands. So this is the imaging of the upper eyelid on eversion, and this is the lower eyelid. So basically, you have to trace all these meibomian glands, and you can directly get a value here. And depending on the areas of dropout here, you can actually quantify the area of the loss and classify the dropout areas into various degrees. However, what you need to note is that these degrees of loss may not necessarily correlate to the extent of the dry eye or the symptoms of the patients which you're seeing. You can also use something to visualize the lipid layer like the LipiView. Now coming to the management. So basically the treatment options that we have are treatment of the tear insufficiency, anti-inflammatory therapy, treatment of the lids, and surgical and dietary approaches, which are not very commonly used. Now coming to the management of the tear insufficiency. So we have a whole lot of tear replacement substitutes that we are going to use. We'll discuss this in the next slides. You can use autologous serum also. Next is to conserve the tears. We can do this by doing a punctal occlusion. This can be done with the help of punctal plugs or punctal cautery. Some patients do benefit by the use of moist chamber spectacles. And the tear stimulation by using oral secretagogues is not very useful. Basically, oral pilocarpine is used, but it's not noted to be very useful. Now, we all know that a whole variety of artificial tears are available. So it is noted in studies that all the molecules which are commonly available almost give you similar results. But just practically, I prefer to use CMC or polyethylene glycol in mild to moderate cases and hyaluronic acid in severe cases. Then it is also better to use a lubricating eye drop which will have some osmoprotectants like L-carnitine and trehalose. And it is preferred to use those lubricatings which have the disappearing preservatives. Vitamin A ointments are also used in some cases, especially in patients with Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Then we need to treat the eyelid abnormalities. It's very commonly what we use is prescribed hot fomentation and lid hygiene. However, many lid wipes and scrubs are available. These patients need to be put on topical antibiotics for a very brief period. If the blepharitis is very chronic, then one needs to look for Demodex and tea tree oil can be used. If the patient has a mild to moderate meibomian gland disease, then you just warm compresses, physical treatment like forced expression with some instruments, and giving them tetracycline topical ointment suffices. However, in some cases, you may need to give them oral tetracyclines or macrolides also. The anti-inflammatory therapy with glucocorticoids, that is soft steroids, is indicated in very specific cases and should be given for a very short duration. What is most important in immunomodulation is cyclosporin and tacrolimus. Tacrolimus has been noted to be giving a slightly better results than cyclosporin. However, the long-term studies are available only for cyclosporin. Also, we know that oral tetracyclines, especially and macrolides like azithromycin, have a very important role, especially in patients with acne rosacea. The surgical approaches of tarsorrhaphy or treatment of conjunctival crisis by doing cautery or by removing the excessive conjunctiva or treatment of essential blepharospasm with botulinum are not required very frequently. Major and minor salivary gland transplantation are done very rarely, especially in patients with Stevens-Johnson syndrome. So the DEWS 2 recommends that you do a stepwise approach, gradually increase the treatment in the patients. After your first step is not working, you go on to the second, third, fourth step. So let's look at each of these steps. The step 1 approach in mild cases would be education regarding the condition, modification of the local environment, that is, discontinuing of toxic medications or lifestyle modifications, then eliminating the offending agents, prescribe the ocular lubricating of your choice, treat the patient's ocular surface with lid hygiene and warm compresses as the case may be. In the second step, if there is no improvement, it is preferred that you shift to a non-preserved ocular lubricating agent and a nighttime gel application. Now, the role of punctal plugs comes in this stage. You can either use the punctal plugs or you can use punctal cautery. If the MGD is severe, then you can use device-assisted management of MGD, which you can do, say, with the IPL. That's quite useful in some cases. Now, the use of topical steroids and antibiotics, as we discussed in the previous slides, has to be done very selectively. I would also suggest that chloroquine in the Indian context would fall into this second step, probably personally for me, before I start topical cyclosporin. The third step is in very severe cases of, say, primary or secondary Sjogren's syndrome or neurotrophic keratitis, where the patients are not benefiting with your regular medications. Autologous serum can be very useful, and scleral lenses like PROS are also very useful. The last step, which is surgical punctal occlusion, amniotic membrane grafts, are required very rarely. However, personally, I think I would put surgical punctal occlusion higher up in the list and probably use it as the first thing in patients who have a very severe dry eye. So in summary, I would say that understanding the pathophysiology and the classification of dry eye aids in planning the treatment flow. Clinical examination along with the use of various diagnostic devices helps in quantifying and staging the disease better. Determination of the cause and the severity of the dry eye is essential, and a stepwise approach as outlined in the management should be followed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kunjal, for a detailed presentation. I would now request the moderators to put in their points, and then we'll take up the chat. Dr. Vinay, sir.
I'll just stop sharing my screen once.
There's a green button on top.
Yeah.
Dr. Vinay, sir. Dr. Vinay, sir, am I audible to you?
Yes, sir. I can hear you.
Yeah. So your comments on both the topics?
I think both the speakers have quite succinctly and precisely continued and completed their discussions. Most of the presentation was self-explanatory. So the only thing which I have to say is that each one of us will have certain different experiences. So therefore, the DEWS can serve as a baseline from which you have to take off. You cannot use it as, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. As Kunjal also mentioned, there are some things which they may say step 3, but you may feel it should be better off in step 2 or vice versa. So you need to have a tailor-made approach is what I would say.
Sure. Dr. Kavita?
Yeah, wonderful presentations by both the speakers. Really well done. Hijab, I really liked your talk, and you showed a patient where you said it was difficult to put in the speculum prior to cataract surgery because of the fibrosis. So I think I'd like to ask you, if you have a patient like that with a pseudopemphigoid, how would you manage it differently? Because sometimes, do you think there's a role of conjunctival biopsy in these cases? And like how would you further manage, because stopping anti-glaucoma drops may not be possible. So how are you
No,
going
no.
to manage that patient?
These patients, then either you consider surgical option for glaucoma. Basically, they are known glaucoma patients, and you have been seeing them chronically over a period of time. And I don't think that they have got mucous membrane pemphigoid. This is a known thing. It's one of the known complications of chronic glaucoma therapy, that they develop a pseudopemphigoid-like picture. So you can easily open, meaning you can open, but you feel it is stiff while opening the speculum. There's resistance offered by the lid. So I wouldn't do a conjunctival biopsy, but maybe a surgical option for glaucoma management would be better, so that the conjunctiva doesn't get worse.
So I think that's the take-home message we can give out, that probably there's no role for a biopsy, especially if you have been seeing the patient. Now probably the patient is coming to you for the first time and you're seeing something like this, and the history of having any bulle or hospitalization is vague. One may not be sure, but by and large, I would say if you feel it is a pseudopemphigoid, there's no role of biopsy. So Kunjal, great presentation yours as well. I had a question for you, for the for the help of all the people who are watching, all the ophthalmologists. If one wants to set up a dry clinic, as you showed so many instruments, what is the basic you think is required for setting up a dry clinic?
So probably that is exactly what I have been following, because I do not have any of the fancy equipments. Basically you, in addition to having all the theoretical knowledge, Schirmer strips, staining strips with fluorescein and Lesamine green are desirable. And I think one needs to train oneself for being able to do meibography with at least your autoref. And the next thing I feel like a practical thing that I'm talking in Bombay is that we now have the devices which you can call for, and they will help you to do, like the SBM ocular surface analyzer is available on rent, and if you ask for it, you can do the non-invasive breakup time analysis, the lipid layer analysis, the meibography, everything, and that actually is very useful because you can demonstrate everything clinically to the patient. So it's not really theoretical, but you have something to show the patient and give a report in the patient's hand. So I think these are the few things I would like to have in my practice.
Yeah, wonderful pointers there. And I think also, if some people have topography, just looking at the SRI index on that also gives us gives a very objective view of the patient's surface if you do not have the fancy dry equipment. So yeah, great talks by both speakers.
Last but not least, Dr. Mamta, we would like to hear your point of view.
Yeah, it was a nice presentation, Hijab. I just wanted to ask you that beside the teardrop, which is drops which we are using in the glaucoma, the surgical antimetabolites which are being used as 5-FU, mitomycin, do you think that they also result in the dry eye?
Not mitomycin, that won't result in dry, meaning as in it's used intra in glaucoma. So that really doesn't make any difference. But 5-FU injection is given to prevent scarring post-op. So then that stays on the ocular surface for a long time. So that the effect of 5-FU is a more long-acting effect because it is post-op. Mitomycin C is used intra, which we use for 2 minutes and then we wash off. So though it is more potent, it is used for a short time, so it does not cause ocular surface damage per se. But 5-FU, because it is used post-op as a subconjunctival injection close to the bleb, under the bleb, that is more toxic. And they give repeated injections also sometimes. So again, it would also depend upon the susceptibility of the individual patient. There are some people who may be able to tolerate that toxicity better than others. So it will depend upon the number of times that the subconjunctival 5-FU has been given.
Yeah, that's correct. Besides this, there are neuropathic factors also in the patients of glaucoma, that is, they are unable to identify the features of the dry eye, the symptoms of the dry eye because of the neuropathic deficiency. So what you will be saying about that? Can you?
I didn't get the question, Dr. Mamta.
Yeah, the glaucoma patients, some of the glaucoma patients, since they have diabetes and other systemic disorders, they do not appreciate the symptoms of the dry eye. And when we find the signs are there, but the symptoms are not there, that is, we can see the MTT and everything, all the signs which of the dry eye can be appreciated, but the patients are asymptomatic because of the. So, what do you say about them? What should we do for these type of the patients?
If they're asymptomatic and if you're still seeing the signs, then you still need to give them a preservative-free formulation. You still need to give them a lubricant. Like that, at least you tell them that, use it as and when. Even if you don't have a problem, at least use a lubricating gel once at night or once in the afternoon.
Yeah, so it means that we have to explain the patient the situation because he's unable to appreciate it. We have to make them understand that this is the situation and you may go on to a difficult situation later. That's what I wanted to point it out. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, Kunjal, it was a nice presentation. I would just like to know about a few mucolytics if you are using in your practice.
Sorry, few?
Mucolytic agents. Which are you using for the dry eye
I'm
patient?
sorry, I missed out on that. Sorry. Yeah, so it's not infrequent to use acetylcysteine, which you can prepare directly from the injection. Basically, the only indication in my practice is to give it when I see filamentary keratitis. And supposing the patient has had filamentary keratitis for a long time, then I will start it the first time I see the patient, along with lubricating, soft steroids, and mucolytic agents. And what basically you can order a mucomix injection or acetylcysteine of any brand and see what concentration you're getting. If you're getting 10% is also fine. If you're getting 20%, that is ideal. You just have to empty any lubricating bottle and fill it up and give it directly to the patient. If you get a higher concentration, then you just dilute it with the lubricating to make it 20%. And I usually give it 4 times a day and usually for 10 to 15 days. And if after stopping there is no recurrence of the filaments, then I stop it. Otherwise, I give a couple of extra cycles also of these agents.
Hijab, I had a question for you, Hijab. Just one question. In practically, if you're seeing a patient with glaucoma using, having a very bad ocular surface, especially sometimes with brimonidine, do you recommend that any soft steroid should be used and at the same time? Have you ever done that clinically?
Yeah, no, I have done that many times. Many times I give them something like lodeprednol etabonate many times to control the ocular surface inflammation. And there are some patients who are also on cyclosporin because they have this chronic inflammation. So I have given.
There is a question in the chat box about the vitamin A ointment. So we have iFlow-Max, which has around 1,000 units of vitamin A along with the carbomer. So that can be used. There are some surgeons who have noted increase in the vascularization of the cornea with the use of iFlow-Max, but personally, I haven't really found that. And I basically use the vitamin A ointment only in patients of Stevens-Johnson syndrome because there is a cycle which relates the vitamin A and the keratinization. There is a lot of science to it, and that's why I selectively use it only in those patients in which I see early lid margin changes or early keratinization. And there's a question about using a device for the expression of the secretions of the meibomian gland. I request Dr. Vinay Agrawal to elaborate because I think he uses that the most.
Okay, see, essentially, as far as expression of the meibomian gland is concerned, you can start with something as simple as using any kind of a device which can compress the lid. So if you use even a, sorry?
Go ahead, sir, go ahead.
Okay, so essentially it can use, if it is a very small amount of work that you need to do, you can use a simple forceps also. But what I use in my clinic essentially is there are paddles which are there, or forceps which are designed with soft paddle-like approaches in the front. So that can be used in cases where there is a severe meibomitis. In case there is a severe meibomial gland obstruction, then in those cases, they may need local infiltration with anesthesia, local anesthesia, and then a compression also associated with punctum probing, because what happens many a times is that the punctal openings of these meibomian glands can be obstructed because of epithelialization or keratinization. So you need to pop them open and then the secretions come out much easier. So that is what I am doing, and that is what is standard recommendation, because otherwise you will not get the results from this. At the same time, one important point which I would like to inform of everybody is that this is not a cure. What I mean is, if you do one expression doesn't mean that now the patient's meibomian glands have been reset or rebooted. You need to inform the patient that there may still be a requirement for redoing these treatments at some point in the future. Usually 6 to 10 months is what I have seen as the period during which the patients are comfortable.
There is one more question by Dr. Vishakha Tanna regarding role of omega-3 in dry eyes. Could any of the panelists take up that question?
I used to use it very selectively. But after the DREAM study, we know that it's not proven to be very beneficial. However, I still feel a very small subset of very chronic MGD patients may be the target, patients for whom you can try and use omega-3. But honestly, I've never been able to understand, whether the patients really had any difference, and they get bored after 1 or 2 months and start asking whether you want to continue. And then, you also don't know whether it's working. So essentially, I used to just stop the medication.
I have to disagree there, even though the DREAM study says that it does not work. But if you see the placebo in DREAM study is nothing but olive oil. I personally feel that yes, it does work. I mean, I don't know, the rest of the panelists can also opine, but I do believe it works, and I try and give it for around 3 to 6 months, and then stop it maybe for a month or two, and again continue it. So that's my practice. That's what I follow in clinical practice.
Dr. Vinay sir, your opinion?
I am not a very strong believer. I am not a very strong believer of omega-3, so I don't really use it much.
Hijab has to tell the scales now.
No, I give all the vitamins, I believe. As long as there is not any harm, I think it's good. At least something I feel is better than nothing. So
No, that is our own satisfaction.
yeah, maybe. So I actually feel that some multivitamin is good.
That is
Along
fair
with
enough.
omega-3 fatty acids.
Yeah, that take is fair enough.
We'll have a BOA dues workshop and we'll decide finally.
Right.
There is one more question from Dr. Kenia, rather a comment. Preservatives are not just the culprits. pH osmolarity buffers in the eye drops are generally not looked into. Have we covered that particular aspect? Dr. Hijab, I think it's directed to.
Actually, the pH of the drop would depend upon the manufacturing process and all the active product in the drug, the excipients and the buffers and whatever the formulation of the medicine would depend on the manufacturer. So if you have a standard company, the manufacturing process will be standard and the pH will be standard. So you will have the same product each time. So always I feel that if patients have got dry eyes, then you go for preservative-free formulation of a good company. I mean, I don't want to put anybody down, but somehow I feel that those products are more standard and they work. And there's less chance of having some pH problem or any problem.
I think well said, Hijab. It is pH which is important, and a standard product should have a standard pH. But we need to also keep in mind that certain products would have a different pH, like those drops which sting. Inherently, they sting because they are on the acidic side of the pH spectrum. So that is something which needs to be kept in mind. So pH by default is not always neutral.
Correct. So patients who have genuine dry eyes, I think it's better to use preservative-free drops from standard companies, because there are so many drops. All of us are flooded with requests for all kinds of lubricating drops, but we can prescribe all of them. But for genuine patients who have definite signs of dry eyes, I think better to stick to standard companies. And if you use the preserved drops also too many times, like there's a question here that too much of teardrops, will they harm? So if there's too much of preservative going in the eye, it will harm. So if you're putting too many times, a preservative-free formulation is preferred. Now you have these preservative-free drops in Novelia technology bottles. Maybe we can look at using one of those formulations which come in the Novelia technology.
I'll just like to add up. Although we are giving all the pharmacological treatment, but besides this, what I feel is some of the patients of mild to moderate dry eye, when they come and they get relief within a short period of the treatment, they just stop follow-up. So we have to make them understand that it is a long, you need to follow up regularly so that you don't convert into a higher degree of dry eye. What do you say regarding this, Dr. Vinay, and everybody else?
I think counseling forms the bedrock of any chronic disease, and dry eye has to be looked upon as a chronic disease, and only then can we actually do service to the patient.
There's one last question from the chat. Dr. Sandeep Ingre is asking the role of LipiFlow pre-operatively. What is the role of LipiFlow pre-operatively?
I have no experience with LipiFlow, so I would not be able to answer that. But to put it a little differently, I would say that management of meibomian gland disease or dry eye pre-operatively would be very crucial for getting a good post-operative result and avoiding the post-operative inflammatory cascade which would otherwise start. So whether you use LipiFlow or whether you use any other modality, it has to be controlled before we do it.
Pritam sir, any more questions? Or
Covered most of the questions on the chat. Would any of our panelists like to make any remarks, anything?
Yeah,
I like just to, yeah, Kavita, please. Kavita, please.
Yeah, sorry. I wanted to add to Kunjal about the dry eye clinic setting up. Yes, basics are definitely enough. I think I wanted to add that, we should introduce or start using the OHDI questionnaire more actively, all of us, because that also is going to give you a lot of input on how the patient is, what kind of dry eye disease he has. By just looking at your questionnaire, once you start reading it, you'll get an idea of which kind of dry eye he's fitting into, whether it's a neuropathic pain, whether it's an aqueous deficiency. And also each time he's coming to you on a follow-up, you can look at the score and know whether he's doing better or not. So that would be a good tool and a very cheap tool to have, rather free tool to have in your dry eye clinic.
Absolutely agree. Very valid point.
Yeah, I'll just like to ask the experiences of everybody. If regarding the dry eyes in children, we always have been focusing for the dry eyes in young and in old age people, but do anybody have a good experience regarding the dry eye in the children? Because there has been no studies regarding it, but we do find the children having the dry eyes along with the allergic conjunctivitis association and many other associations. So anybody who has the experience regarding this regard?
I see a lot of pediatric dry eye, so it is not as unknown or unthought of as we tend to be. It's only overlooked because, as you rightly pointed out, it is perceived as a disease of old age. With the increasing use of video screens, and I am surrounded by quite a number of elite schools, so we have found a number of patients. And in fact, though I have not yet published it, I am in the process. We have put together data wherein the meibomian gland appearance of many of these children appears far more distorted than their age would suggest. Like I have, off the top of my head, I can recount at least 5 or 7 patients I have whose meibomian gland pictures would look like a 40-year-old or a 50-year-old. So there are huge number of problems which are right now under the radar, but it is an emerging area where we will have a lot of problems because of the basic usage of video screens.
Dr. Vinay, do you follow any other strategy for those children, or is it the same strategy as?
See, the basic problem which I am not able to resolve is the lifestyle change, because what happens is the parents as well as the children need to be on the same page. So other than that, there is nothing else that I can offer. So basically, the approach is anti-inflammatory and lubricants. These are the only 2 things which can really be offered. But the key thing which I have seen in children is if those who listen, they recover much faster than an adult patient. So reversal has been seen. I have seen reversals in their meibomian gland pictures after about 2 to 3 months of a proper modification of the lifestyle.
No, I'm going to take this opportunity because we still have a lot of time remaining, and all 5 of you all are fantastic cornea specialists we have on the panel today. So I'm going to ask each of you in 2 to 3 minutes, because in the current situation, all of us are just starting our clinics, our OPD, and we are scared about how to, the slit lamp examination, how to go close to the patient, because we know that the corona itself is there in the tear film conjunctiva. So I'm going to ask each one of you, in short, if you can tell us how you all are doing your slit lamp examination, in what you think is a safe way of doing it. Maybe you can start with Vinay, sir.
See, essentially, the way I have not yet started my OPD, so I would not say from my experience, but what I am mentally preparing to do, or there's a protocol that I would follow. I would, of course, restrict my touching of the patient. Having said that, that may not always work, because most of the cornea work and the lid external disease work is going to require that the lids either be touched and lifted or upturned. The thing which I have planned for is something which I had seen in one of my fellowships, though I never implemented it, is if I have to upturn the lid, I am not going to use my finger and thumb as most of us have been doing for a very long time. What we used to do is the earbuds can be used to upturn the lid and then see it. So that is one thing which I am going to implement clearly.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Second thing is that I probably would use a glove when I am touching the patient's eye, regardless of whatever I am thinking or not thinking. I would assume that every patient is a positive patient and behave accordingly. In addition, of course, the standard things that we all do, in the sense that the interface shield, wearing your own face shield, all of those things are a given.
Kunjal, anything to add to this?
No, same thing as sir said, I am really not seeing patients yet, and till now I've been able to manage with photographs. But I think once we start, what I think I'm going to do is for follow-up cases, which I know the history a little bit and the findings. If they're symptomatically better, I'm not going to go behind documenting, the tear volume or the staining pattern. I'd probably wait for that a little bit more. And cotton buds, yeah, I anyways use quite a bit of cotton buds routinely. So that's a very good reminder that sir has given me. And staining and all also, I think it will be important if the patient's symptoms are very simple, like computer vision, I will not bother with the staining. But when necessary, I think we have to go ahead and do it.
Kunjal, I would ask you a question. As a cornea specialist, why do you need to stain the patient?
Sorry, why do you?
As a cornea specialist, why would you need to stain the patient? Technically speaking, if the eye is going to stain, most of it is going to be visible on a high magnification slit lamp examination. So technically, I am now veering towards a thought process that staining should be done only if absolutely mandatory. I would not even look upon it as a routine tool as I used to for dry eye.
Right. True. Any thoughts, Kavita?
Yeah, Preetham, about your comment about coronavirus in the tears, there's just one pilot study which has been published in BJO where they had 30 patients and they found corona positive. I think they did a PCR and they found it only in one of the patients, the tears having corona. So I'm not very sure that we are really exposed to the coronavirus through the tears. It's mostly through the breath and the droplets that we need to worry about. Currently, we are not really doing routine in the hospital, but we are seeing patients. As of now, we are wearing full PPE. There's cleaning which is happening. There's a breath shield, there's cleaning of the slit lamp, everything which is happening between each patient, double gloves and gloves being discarded, and all of that. And just another point I wanted to add is that no NCT. I think most of us know it, because when you're doing NCT on the patient, it's literally like the patient coughing onto your face. So no NCT as of now. We are not using NCT for tonometry. Yeah, so that's all.
Dr. Mamta, Dr. Hijab?
The same thing as Kavita said, double gloves, keep sanitizing, keep applying sanitizer over the second glove, and in between keep changing. In addition to the mask and the face shield.
One more thing I would like to add, not as a cornea specialist, but just as anybody else. Whenever you take off your gloves, many of us have this habit of, just taking it off with a significant amount of force. So that is something which should not be done, because if the surface of the glove is contaminated, you will be releasing aerosols if you have a firm release of the glove. So it should be a very soft release, sort of roll out kind of a approach when you're taking off your gloves.
Yes, as a parallel to that, in AIIMS, I think Dehradun, in spite of wearing the gloves and the face mask and all, still a lot of doctors turned out corona positive, and what they found that they were not doffing the entire gear properly. So that's a very relevant point, Dr. Vinay. When we're doffing out of the gear, also we need to be very careful at how we are doing.
Because this has to be a soft approach. Anything which you use very strong, very arbitrary strength, then it's going to cause more aerosols to be released.
True.
And as far as them being positive, I have a feeling that reusing this N95 business is going to be a big question mark, which we don't have an answer.
No, because I prefer asking many people, because you sometimes you pick up one or two positive things
Absolutely.
from one person.
Absolutely.
So this thing about taking off your gloves is something which will be my take home today. Like, you don't take out your gloves in a sudden jerky manner, because, we have this habit, like triumphant warriors after a surgery or after
Absolutely.
put your gloves and chuck it somewhere.
Correct.
So this will be a fantastic take home for me, at least, that to remove the gloves, roll it over and gently put it in the place where we are going to discard it.
Ideally, you should have somebody put sterilium on it first and then take it out. Ideally.
Yes.
And I also have the routine habit of taking it out from the back surface, because in case you've touched anything from this surface, this you haven't touched anyway. So it's a reflex habit that I have, that I always remove glass from this side.
I think there are a lot of videos on YouTube which are showing the proper technique of doffing out. We could, watch that. That will definitely help.
I think that's a lot of material is available.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think I would like to conclude then our today's webinar. I thank both the speakers, Dr. Hijab and Dr. Kunjal. They're fantastic presentations. They're already getting compliments on the chat for your presentation. And thank you, Dr. Vinay, for being here and giving us some valuable points. Dr. Mamta, Dr. Kavita, thank you so much. And Swapnesh, over to you. Would you like to say something about?
Thank you very much. It was well received, and even in these times, we had a good attendance. We crossed almost 100 at one point. Just to share, our next topic would be, we are going back to retinal vein occlusions, coming up on 7th of May. That is a Thursday, same time, 6 to 7, with the same ID and the password. So with your permission and with the moderator's permission, the meeting has to be ended now.
So thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Remember, there's a section 144. There's curfew from 8 p.m. to 7 a.m. So stay home, stay safe, take care.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody.
Thank you, Preetham. Wonderful session. Thank you.
Swapnesh, end the meeting.